The stories. This dispatcher flagged a warning nobody else heard. In the summer of 2015, a small county dispatch center in the Midwest logged what should have been another quiet night routine calls, minor accidents, nothing serious. But at 2:36 a.m., dispatcher Lorna Keats flagged a single line in the call log with a red warning tag. The rest of the shift didn't notice. 12 hours later, a missing person report came in from the same road. Lorna was 52, a mother of three, and one of the few veteran dispatchers still working nights. She'd spent more than 20 years listening to the county breathe through static. Drunk drivers, runaway teens, distant gunshots that usually turned out to be fireworks. That night, she was scheduled to train a new hire, Evan Rhodes, a quiet 20-something fresh out of community college. He remembered her as calm, methodical someone who double-checked even the quiet calls. The call in question lasted just 19 seconds. It came from an unregistered prepaid cell phone traced to the stretch of County Route 47 between mile markers 19 and 20. The caller didn't say much, just a breathy male voice repeating, "He's still here," before the line cut. Background noise? Steady hum, maybe an engine, maybe wind? Lorna replayed the audio 3 times, then filed it under possible domestic disturbance. But something made her stop the recording and reopen it. According to her later statement, she heard a faint ticking sound under the voice mechanical, uneven. Like a turn signal that never clicked off, she said. At 2:38, she added a note, "Warning possible vehicle hazard, County 47. No one responded. The patrol car assigned to that region had already been rerouted to a stranded motorist 15 miles away. The shift ended at 6, and by the next day, the flag was buried beneath dozens of other overnight notes. 2 days later, a farmer found a truck half submerged in a drainage ditch along the same stretch of road. Inside was 30-year-old Bradley Norham, a construction worker from a nearby town. Engine still idling, phone missing, seatbelt unlatched. Coroner placed the time of death around 2:40 that same morning, within minutes of Lorna's flagged call. County investigators wrote it up as a single-vehicle accident. They said Bradley likely swerved to avoid a deer, hit the embankment, and drowned before he could escape. Lorna, however, couldn't let it go. She'd handled too many wrecks to ignore the timing. The ticking sound, the phrase, "he's still here," the untraceable number, it didn't add up. A week later, she retrieved the audio from archive storage and took it home on a thumb drive. Her husband found her replaying it that evening, headphones pressed tight, not speaking for almost an hour. She said she thought she heard 2 different voices, one layered under the main one. A whisper, or maybe a radio echo, she told him. He dismissed it as interference, but Lorna wasn't satisfied. She called the phone company listed in the report, Westridge Cellular, to ask about prepaid tower logs. The representative told her the call had pinged off a repeater near Old Mill Road, 2 miles east of the crash. Problem was, that tower had been offline for maintenance between midnight and 3 a.m. She double-checked through county records. The outage was confirmed. If that was true, the call shouldn't have connected at all. When she brought this to her supervisor, he told her it wasn't her concern. "The system hiccups sometimes," he said. "Let it go." Instead, she filed a quiet memo through the internal server detailing her findings and sent a copy to a friend in the State Highway Patrol. The friend, Officer Miriam Cole, kept the note, but admitted later she didn't think much of it until months afterward. Then, in November of that year, a storm knocked out power across the same district. During the outage, technicians discovered a repeater box still running from an auxiliary generator, a model decommissioned years earlier. Inside it was a burned SIM card fused into the port. Serial number partially visible. It matched the first digits of the untraceable phone from Lorna's warning. This detail never made the official report. A small internal inquiry followed, but concluded there was no functional link between the repeater malfunction and any known incident. By that point, Lorna had already transferred to a day shift. She told coworkers she didn't want to hear the night anymore. Years later, a regional journalist researching abandoned communication systems stumbled on the archived memo. The journalist, Alan Marin, interviewed Lorna at her kitchen table in 2020. By then, she'd retired and moved to a smaller town near the river. In the recording, which he later shared for a local podcast, she said something quietly that caught his attention. "You know what gets me?" he said. "He's still here." Not, "I'm still here." Someone else was supposed to hear it. Alan followed the breadcrumb trail dispatch logs, weather reports, the crash file, and that malfunctioning repeater. He found that the generator inside had been serviced twice after its supposed decommission date, each time by a subcontractor called Northspan Utilities. Northspan had folded in 2013, 2 years before the incident. Whoever maintained that repeater after the shutdown wasn't listed in county records. Alan managed to contact one former Northspan technician, a man named Dennis Harlow. Dennis said that in the early 2000s, some repeaters were used to piggyback maintenance frequencies for nearby rail lines. It was a cheap way to test emergency signals, he said. But it was never supposed to overlap with civilian channels. If it did, you'd get bleed-through, like ghost calls. Ghost calls. That term caught traction online when Alan's podcast aired, though Lorna hated it. She said the word ghost turned it into superstition, not signal bleed, not malfunction. Still, she admitted the possibility haunted her. The crash site, the voice, the timestamp, they lined up too neatly. In 2021, the county repaved Route 47, covering the drainage ditch. The wreckage was long removed, but for maintenance training, new dispatchers were still shown the red-flagged log from that night as a case study in procedural diligence. The warning nobody else heard became a quiet legend among the staff, half cautionary tale, half proof of how easily small details slip away. What remained were fragments. The 19-second clip archived under a generic file name, the memo Lorna wrote, the service invoices from Northspan, and the coroner's note listing water in the lungs. Each on its own could mean nothing. Together, they formed a pattern too odd to ignore but too thin to prove. Lorna passed away in 2023. At her retirement gathering the year before, a few old colleagues brought up the story. She just smiled and said, "It was probably static." Then, according to Evan, her trainee from that night, she added quietly, "But static comes from somewhere." At this point, the facts that remained were simple. One call, one warning, one man dead on a dark county road. The system logged everything perfectly except for the truth behind that 19-second window. Whether it was interference, a misrouted test frequency, or something else, no one could ever show exactly who made that call or why it stopped where it did. Still, in the dispatch training manual filed a few years later, there's a footnote beside Lorna's case study. It reads, "Always listen twice before you clear a line." No capital letters, no bold text, just quiet advice embedded between procedural codes. A reminder that sometimes the sound we dismiss as noise might be the only signal that matters. The bridge collapse files of Red River County. Locals in Clarksville still point toward the slow bend of the Red River and mention a span that failed without warning. They talk about a sound like lumber snapping across a barnyard and a brown cloud that rolled off the water. Some say the river went quiet for a full minute. Others insist the current rushed harder against the pilings. The event sits between printed pages and tired memories, where dates blur and names drift across coffee counters. Investigators never confirmed a single narrative, and the surviving paperwork reads like a map with two north arrows. The first name that appears across the county file from 2009 is Thomas Avery, 52, consulting civil engineer, in town to review seasonal scour near the east abutment. He arrived from Texarkana on a rented pickup, carried a folding stadia rod, and booked a room at a roadside motor court. His notes, reportedly scanned and misplaced twice, show pencil sketches with neat arrows along gravel approaches. He wrote that spring runoff had undercut a clay shelf and that riprap placement lagged a full year. He planned a second pass at lower water with a contractor present and a county foreman on site. Dispatch logs from the same period reference Maria Kent, 41, paramedic with Red River EMS, sent toward the span after a motorist report about drifting planks. Her unit rolled north on farm-to-market roads with steady radio checks and a quiet engine whine. The log timestamps conflict with her own written addendum, which places her arrival 8 minutes before the first deputy. She noted empty guardrails and a harder breeze from the west that pushed dust into the shallows. She stayed at the south approach and waited for a crew to secure a lane with cones and a chain. A third figure threads through state records and later summaries: Caleb Ross, 29, county road crew foreman, scheduled to meet Avery for a survey walk. He reportedly left the yard early with a steel tape, a faded vest, and a thermos dented along one side. The daybook from his shop lists a fuel top off at 6, a load of rock at 7, and a plan to check the far pier before lunch. Some locals claimed Ross stopped at a grocery for ice and never returned to the truck. Others stated he reached the bridge and waved toward the river. The record of his exact route remains unsettled, and the receipt pile is thinner than expected. Archive notes say the span was a modest truss with timber decking and 3 concrete piers set in an easy channel. The far bank rose into cottonwoods, and the near bank held a graded turnout where anglers backed trailers down a slab. Maintenance logs speak of patched planks and a cracked bearing plate that had been shimmed on a wet afternoon. The repair order shows a red pencil remark that reads, "Still serviceable under single lane only." No one signed a final clearance, and the renewal request died in a stack under a broken stapler. When the structure failed, the sequence becomes a field of magnets pulling in different directions that never quite align. One witness claimed the center deck dropped first and sent a chalky burst downstream. Another insisted the south approach slumped after a truck braked near the crown. A rancher reported hearing 2 distinct impacts with river echoes that sounded like a hallway door. A retired teacher described one long groan as if the river dragged a wet rope across iron. The statements share details but resist consensus, and each page announces certainty with careful handwriting. Avery's pocket notebook surfaced in a banker's box long after the final insurance letter closed. The pages record a sounding taken with a weighted line that read 14 near the mid-channel and 9 closer to the leaning pier. He wrote that drift loads had increased after a storm in early spring and that the upstream pile showed fresh scars. There is a sketch of a void under the clay lip where minnows flick through pale water. He underlined a sentence about scour mitigation with quarry stone and a call to confirm availability within 2 weeks. Kent filed her final report with a tone that suggests fixed habits and a tired office chair. She lists scene hazards that include rebar ends, loose decking, and silt clouds that limit visibility under the truss. She notes a single pickup at the turnout with no occupants and an open toolbox on the tailgate. She records a radio check to County Fire and a request for mutual aid from a neighboring district. Her remarks end with a line about river traffic and 2 anglers who declined to provide names due to a pending tournament. Ross appears next in a terse memo that cites secondhand remarks and a phone call that reached voicemail twice. The memo claims he had walked the south bank with Avery a week earlier and marked 3 soft pockets with orange paint. It suggests he planned to return with fabric and stone once the river fell below the chalk line on the pier. The last certain fact is a signed receipt for gloves and a set of safety glasses at a hardware counter near the square. Every later detail arrives from someone who heard something in a cafe and tucked it between lunch notes. State records list 2 inspections spread across 5 years, with photographs that show a lean toward the east and a hairline crack along a bearing seat. The earlier inspection recommended a load posting that never appeared on either approach. The later inspection assigned a priority that competed with 3 other spans and a culvert collapse on a farm road. A funding note mentions a grant request that stalled after a change in office staff. The document trail grows faint as winter budgets pressed into spring potholes. Mechanical analysis came from a district engineer who used calm sentences and short clauses built for public meetings. He identifies repeated wetting and drying cycles along the timber deck that forced nails to creep. He points toward undermined clay and a narrowed channel that bent current lines against the mid-pier. He writes that a failure origin cannot be fixed with absolute precision due to scoured evidence and missing deck pieces. He asks for a dewatering plan and a crane that never materialized. The county file from 2009 includes photographs with date stamps that do not match the captions typed below. One frame shows a sagging guardrail with rust blooms and a waterline printed like a belt across concrete. Another shows tire marks that end at a splintered edge and a hat resting on a plank. A third shows an empty river surface patterned by wind from the west and a line of bubbles near the far pier. The chain of custody sheet lists a deputy who transferred out and a clerk who retired without an exit interview. Reporters drew maps on legal pads and drove the approaches with a cautious speed of someone reading old pavement for hints. Their articles stitched interviews with shop owners and two fishermen who claimed the river changed color after the first impact. One piece quoted a former inspector who said budget cycles have their own weather and you dress for whatever arrives. Another quoted a county commissioner who insisted the span stood within normal service metrics. The printed narratives offered resolve, while the river ignored the words and moved on. Avery left town within a week, recorded by a receipt for fuel and a breakfast ticket punched with a dull hole. He returned once in late summer to present a slide deck with cross-sections and equation lines that bored the room. He recommended stone placement and new bearings cut for the southern seat. He suggested a temporary Bailey to restore a single lane with strict limits. The minutes reflect nods without motion and a closing remark about waiting for cooler weather. Kent rotated off the ambulance for a quarter and took dispatch shifts under bright fluorescent light that flattened the hours. She handled calls about livestock on roads and a boy with a broken wrist and an older man short of breath. When the bridge comes up, her voice stays neutral while her hands move over paper with careful steadiness. She writes that the river remains a hazard zone and that signage needs nightly checks. She never claims more than the logs can support, and her addenda end with standard phrasing. Ross's path fades, where the road leaves town and crosses open fields toward the old ferry traces. Some locals claimed he was seen near the cottonwoods with a level rod, others placed him at a diner booth that never matched the receipt times. A cousin remembered a story about hauling stone past sunset while the radio caught distant stations. A former coworker insisted Ross called about fabric rolls and left a voicemail that never saved. The file keeps his name, but not his last location, and the river keeps its distance from closure. By winter, the approaches were fenced with mesh, and the signs leaned under north wind that smelled like iron. A temporary span sat in the planning folder and moved between committees like a slow truck. The budget hearings pressed on with pipe repairs and a school roof that leaked onto maps. The river dropped into pale seams across sandbars, and the water showed twisted metal like ribs. People drove around the detour and learned new turns that soon felt old. In spring, a work crew staged rock on the south bank and built a ramp with compacted fill and a simple slope. They moved stone against the lean of the current and watched the water change sound as voids filled. They left gaps where the divers wanted clear space and marked a lane with tall posts. A man with a clipboard checked quantities while a crane idled near the turnout. Nothing in the record names him, and no photograph shows his face. Years later, the road pulls straight toward a replacement span that rides higher over a more disciplined channel. The guardrails shine against early sun, and the deck hums under light traffic that stays within the posted signs. Downstream, the old pilings sit in shallow water like molars under a tired gum line. People fish near the shade and glance toward the bank where the gravel turnout still holds a hard edge. The current moves past their boots and says nothing that a recorder can keep. The file ends without a conclusive sentence, and the county clerk wrote, "Closed for now," along the final margin. The failure sits among numbers and measured lines and voices that hold equal conviction. The river holds its own private archive and never shares the index with the courthouse. The names remain in lists that wait for some future reader to try another alignment. Paper can repeat a story, yet the sound that began the story does not return. The stories. This highway turnout kept a secret roadside ledger. The turnout sat 3 miles past the hill crest, where the shoulder widened and an old guardrail curled around scrub pines. It looked like any layover patch on a western freight route, wind-scoured and sun-bleached. the kind of place drivers used when the low gear cooked too hot. Ivo Calderon was 34 and worked highway maintenance out of a county yard near a small valley town. He had the steady patience of someone who counted reflectors at dawn, and he kept a pocket notebook for bolts that liked to work loose. He planned a simple loop that Tuesday: swap a cracked mile marker, replace a dented sign, check the culvert at the turnout. He pulled the county pickup beside the rail and killed the engine, and the quiet after the fan belt felt too clean. He had heard drivers call the turnout a good place to let brakes breathe, and earlier dispatch chatter mentioned a stalled sedan reported before sunrise. The sedan was gone now, but a dark rectangle pressed into gravel showed where tires had slept. He walked the rail, tapped bolts with a wrench, and found a new scar where the metal had curled inward like a knuckle. He crouched to look for glass or plastic, and his fingers met tin. The box felt cold despite the heat, wedged under the rail post with two flat rocks bracing it tight. He checked for snakes first, then slid it out with a sand scuff. Inside was a ledger wrapped in a cut trash bag, bound with string, edges rubbed thin as old denim. On the first page, someone had printed "Mile 37 turnout, keep it dry, return it where you found it." The handwriting was neat, each line pressed with a heavy hand that understood trucks and weather. The early entries read like a log of small trades, which made sense in that place and on that road. Diesel siphoned and replaced with cash, jump starts marked with initials, spare brake light bulbs counted like borrowed pencils. The dates were written carefully as words, like 2019 and 2020, and then the numbers stopped for a while when the world went strange. He flipped to a recent page and noticed a different style, lighter ink and quicker strokes that curled on the downstroke. It said, "Skimmer crew parked by mile 32 according to a driver. Call the county before you accept a tow." Another said, "Gray sedan with a trailer ball gave bottles and left at dawn. Check camera near the crest for plate." He looked at the tin again and found a folded slip beneath the ledger that smelled like lemon cleaner. Someone had written, "If you find this and you work the road, please look at dispatch logs from last winter." He recognized the phrasing and the gentle push, not a demand, more like a tired neighbor asking you to look through a fence. He set the ledger back in the tin, snapped a quick photo for memory, and secured the box the way he had found it. The air felt still, and a low thunder came from the downshift of a distant semi that needed the long lane more than talk. He got in the truck, scratched a date in his pocket notebook, and drove back toward the yard with the uneasy feeling of stepping on a path with fresh footprints. In the office after lunch, he pulled archived calls on the shared computer, which the crew used for storm maps and shift swap. The log from late winter listed a cluster of calls around mile 30, with drivers reporting a two-truck team that arrived fast and unasked. One entry used the word predatory, which was rare in casual notes, and another mentioned cash prices on a scrap of paper. He kept reading and saw a note from a county deputy about skimmers on card readers at a nearby fuel plaza. That plaza sat between the crest and the river bridge, where drivers liked to grab coffee and plug in sleepers to keep a steady chill. He printed the page, then printed the call clusters, and wrote the turnout mile in the margins because he trusted his own ink. The next morning, he returned to the route early, with a thermos and a camera that clipped to the dash like a square eye. He planned to change a reflector near the crest and let the camera watch the turnout. Nothing secret, just habit dressed as curiosity. The road held a thin fog that looked like breath on glass, and the pines below the rail felt damp enough to keep a secret. He parked, waited a few minutes, and watched a box truck pull in slow with brakes sighing like someone settling into a couch. A woman climbed out, mid-40s, hair tied back, shoulders set like someone who carried more than straps and ratchets. She checked her wheels, knocked her lugs with a bar, then walked to the guardrail with a mason jar wrapped in a towel. She crouched where the tin lived, did not look around, and worked like a person who practiced in silence and noticed the small things. She took the ledger out, slid in the folded towel, wrote 3 lines, then added a smaller page clipped by a binder clip that made a sharp click. He felt guilty watching and looked down to pretend his coffee needed attention, which it did not, but pretend worked anyway. He waited until she left, then pretended to check the culvert again, this time with a small shovel that made the roll feel official. He eased the tin out, opened the ledger to the fresh page, and read a tidy note that felt like a breadcrumb. It said, "Tow crew again, near mile 32 last night. Reportedly told a young driver they worked with the county." Another line said, "I am leaving 4 bottles of coolant and a bag of rags for anyone stuck with a pinhole." He wrote a line himself, kept to the ledger tone, and made sure the ink did not bleed through on the thin paper. He wrote, "County maintenance checked the turnout, no affiliation with tow crews, call dispatch if pressured." He tucked his page under the binder clip and slid everything back, angling the rocks to wedge firm because small rituals matter when the wind gets ideas. He drove to the fuel plaza later that morning, the one near the bridge where the skimmers had allegedly lived, and asked around. The cashier, a young guy with a careful haircut, said a retired radio operator sometimes handed out paper maps to drivers who looked lost. Reportedly, he kept notes on who needed help and who pushed scams, and he liked the old ways more than the new screens. The cashier said, "You want Arlene, not me," and pointed at the small sandwich counter where a woman was sorting bread with clean hands. Arlene had the posture of someone who had stood for decades without complaint, and her eyes moved fast, like she listened with more than ears. She listened to Ivo explain his job and his curiosity, then nodded once, like a shop teacher hearing a decent plan. She said, "There is a book, but we do not write full names because we do not want fights here." She said, "Some truckers leave notes about who helped, and sometimes they warn about boys who show up too fast with chains." She added, "A retired dispatcher named Theo started it after 2014 when the corner got tricky, and people forgot how to flag without yelling. Ivo asked if anyone had brought up mile 32 in the last month, and she looked past him like she was reading a chalkboard on a far wall. She said, a kid in a small coupe said 2 trucks boxed him at night and tried to sell a winch like a miracle. She said the kid left when another driver pulled behind him with hazards blinking, which often makes a different kind of math happen. He thanked her and bought a sandwich he had not planned to buy, then sat in his truck and wrote lines in his pocket notebook. He marked the phrases retired dispatcher, ledger, tow scam, and noted that older hands tend to leave cleaner trails than noisy crews. He waited for his coffee to cool, then called the deputy listed on the winter logs and left a message saying he was checking a few things near the crest. The deputy called back that afternoon, voice calm, words clipped like someone who learned to talk over traffic noise. The deputy said there had been several reports of quick tow teams and a few complaints about skimmers, but nothing firm enough for a charge. He added that a neighbor near the climb heard engines idling around midnight often, and his dog growled the way dogs do when a rhythm is wrong. Ivo returned to the turnout at dusk with a reflective vest and a flashlight because nothing good happens when you pretend the dark is friendly. He checked the tin and found another page, this one printed with careful block letters like a patient teacher. It said, "If you need to know, check the gate camera on the service road above the crest and ask for last January." He knew the service road, a narrow cut that served a radio tower, and a wind monitor the county refused to replace. The gate had an old camera that fed a shared system, which logged plates and headlights more than faces and worked better than anyone expected. He sent a request through the county portal and asked for January footage from late night hours, and the reply came with a link and a warning about file size. He watched the clips after dinner on the break room monitor because the screen at home had a cracked corner he never fixed. In one clip, the turnout sat dark and empty until a pair of flatbeds eased in like wolves that knew the fence lines. Minutes later, a small hatchback rolled to a stop, hazard lights pulsing a tired heartbeat, and the flatbeds moved as if pulled by the same string. He watched the first driver step out and talk with quick hands, then watched the second driver circle the hatchback like it had a scent. A third vehicle pulled in and stopped behind the hatchback, a high sleeper with long antenna wires and an American flag sticker on the lower door. The hatchback backed away slow, then faster, and left the turnout with the sleeper following, which made the flatbeds idle in place. Next, he watched late January. And this clip hurt because the rain made everything shine like a wet stage where actors forgot their lines. A refrigerated trailer pulled in with smoke from one wheel, a soft gray that looked almost polite until it thickened at the edges. Within minutes, 2 figures worked the hub, one with a small extinguisher, one holding a flashlight, steady and calm, even as the smoke turned rude. The next page of the ledger joined the footage in his mind and made something click that felt like a seatbelt slipping into place. The page listed a night where a driver named Ash met a retired radio man who carried a milk crate of fuses and flagged traffic by feel. It said Ash made it to the next exit and left a case of water behind the rail as thanks, and the radio man refused cash with a stubborn grin. He started to suspect the ledger was not only a list of favors or warnings, but a quiet schedule for kindness that traveled under the grid. The binder clips held more than paper, they held little runs of trust, and a handful of people had decided the turnout would be a tiny town square. He still had to connect the tow crews to something more firm, or at least line up a clean path between names and nights. He reviewed the January footage again, then compared timestamps against dispatch logs, and found a gap where a call had been recorded but then labeled incomplete. The call preview mentioned a shaky voice saying 2 trucks had blocked a lane near mile 32, and another voice saying help was already on the way. The logs showed no county units listed, and the note ended with line dropped, likely lost signal. He printed the clip stills and wrote notes by hand, careful to keep letters large and unhurried because speed ruined more ink than rain. He visited the plaza again and asked Arlene if she knew a retired radio man named Theo, which made her mouth twitch like a bad joke arrived late. She said Theo still came in on Thursdays to trade old surplus radios for stories he liked better than the radios themselves. On Thursday, she waved Evo to a small table near the window where a thin man sat with a canvas cap and a careful breath. Theo looked at the stills without touching them and asked easy questions about wind direction and how long the trucks had stayed put. He read the ledger note photocopy and raised one eyebrow at the refund line where someone had scratched out an unkind word. Theo said, "That book started when we lost a pullout after a washout in 2014 and needed somewhere to map goodwill." He said, "We kept names light on purpose. No addresses, no hero stories, just notes that kept people honest enough to look in the mirror." He added, "I have reported the cruise twice with plates, but the plates led to a rental maze that likes to erase footprints." Ivo asked if Theo would mind adding a line that county maintenance knew the ledger existed, and Theo nodded once like a metronome. He wrote in a tight script, "County eyes know this book and prefer its honesty, no affiliation with any tow company." He slid the pen back with 2 fingers, then told a quick story about a snow chain locker that used to freeze shut and how a hammer can respect stubborn metal without breaking it. The next week, Evo placed a small metal cabinet behind the rail, painted brown like the dirt, no markings, no lock, just a storm latch. Inside, he put rags, coolant, a cheap inflator, and a folded card that said, "Call dispatch and wait if anyone pressures you about towing." The ledger went into the cabinet with its tin, and a note asked writers to close the latch because the wind enjoyed rude jokes. Word spread in the slow way good habits move when they do not ask for attention or applause. Drivers left cleaner notes with times and directions that avoided names, and one traveler wrote a careful line about a black dog that lay near the rail at night to watch tires pass like planets. A deputy added, quietly and without badge number, that a new camera watched the mile 32 shoulder from an angle the crews did not expect. In early summer, a box truck driver named Kelda wrote about a man who flagged her down and pointed to a soft tire, then asked for cash. She wrote, "I offered water and a phone call, and he left without names," and a second car watched from the shadow near the sign. 2 days later, someone wrote, "Gray sedan again, park lights off, backed away when 2 vehicles pulled in together. Report filed at the substation." The plaza cashier taped a simple note near the register that said, "Tow authorization is free by county phone. Ask before you pay anyone." The retired radio man drew a small map to the turnout for a college kid hauling a couch and told him to rest his brakes in the shade because patience kept families alive. The kid returned a week later and left a bag of chips and a soft drink in the cabinet with a note that said, "Thanks for the air." Evo felt the road change by inches, the way a river shifts after a downed tree moves just enough to stop a hidden whirl. He still checked bolts and reflectors, he still swept glass after fender kisses, he still logged storms the way farmers count clouds. He also read the ledger when the latch stuck, and he understood that small tools, shared quietly, can be stronger than loud plans. In late summer, a line appeared in a new hand, careful and slow, as if the writer wanted the words to stand up straight. It said, "Two trucks tried a price on a young couple in a silver van near mile 32 last night. Another driver blocked and called." It ended, deputies arrived, reportedly took reports, crews left before plates could be confirmed, camera angle improved view. Ivo printed that line for the deputy and handed over the catalyst chain he had assembled, which was not a case file, just a path. The deputy said thanks without a smile and later called to say a larger investigation had opened that spanned beyond their stretch of quiet hills. He did not ask for the ledger, and he did not tell Ivo to stop watching. He only asked that the book stay clean of full names to protect decent people. The turnout kept breathing in its slow way, heat riding off gravel in visible waves that made everything wobble and dreamlike. The ledger pages grew soft at the corners, and someone glued reinforced strips to the spine with care that matched the first handwriting. Now and then, a new driver wrote a sentence that sounded grateful for a simple jug of water left by a stranger with a pencil. A local professor left a note about starting a small roadside history project and asked if anyone minded a photocopy at the library. Theo wrote yes, but keep the copy without names, use dates written as words, and call it the Mile 37 book. The library later displayed a scan that showed a landscape of small trades and warnings, nothing dramatic, just a community stitched by traffic and time. Ivo stopped keeping his own separate notes once the system felt stable enough to grow without him tugging at every thread. He still checked the cabinet latch, still wiped dust off the tin, still tightened bolts with gloves that smelled like oil. And Sunday, he understood the ledger worked because it was specific but humble, and because no one wanted ownership beyond a steady line and clear daylight. When the wind came down from the ridge and the pines whispered like a big crowd that agreed on the same joke, the turnout looked ordinary. It still hid a storage of rags and coolant. It still held a book with entries written in hands that learned patience from asphalt. It still sat 3 miles past the crest, where trucks let their brakes breathe, and people learned to slow down enough to see one another. He remembered the first time he had levered the tin from the dust, felt the weight of words that did not need a speech. He thought about the winter calls, the quick hands at the hub, the quiet driver who blocked a box and made the math different. He thought about how a secret can be a responsibility more than a thrill, and how some secrets work best when shared carefully and left mostly unremarked. Arlene kept handing out maps and sandwiches, the cashier kept teasing drivers about their sweet tooth, and Theo kept trading radios for stories he liked better. The deputy kept watching Mile 32 from an angle that made crews uncomfortable, and the plaza lights kept throwing a honey glow across damp pavement after late rain. The road kept moving people who carried every kind of trouble and hope inside their glove boxes and on their dashboards. The ledger held a few blank pages that looked like future mornings and late nights, and the latch kept closing with a soft click. Travelers kept adding lines that sounded like a handshake, and the turnout kept holding small proof that strangers can decide to be neighbors. The book did not stop every scheme, but it hurt the margins enough that different plans made more sense than the old fast money ones. Ivo still checked the culvert after storms, still measured sediment against last season, still logged a snake sighting when a thicket rattled like loose change. He knew the ledger would change hands again eventually, not because he wanted it, but because the road decides and the people follow. He trained a new hire to watch for bolts that work loose and told him that some fixes start with a pencil and a jar. If anyone asked why the turnout mattered, he would point to the cabinet and the scrub pines and the clean lines of the rail. He would say that a book of simple favors became a ledger of safety, and that safety looked ordinary until you added up the lines. He would not mention names, and he would not tell a single hero story, because none of it needed that kind of shine. The highway kept its stubborn rhythm, and the ledger kept its quiet balance, and both felt honest in a way that made sense. The secret was not really a secret anymore, not to the people who needed it and respected what it asked. It asked for neat lines, shared tools, clear times, and the courage to arrive with hazards on and no need for applause. The ferry passenger who never disembarked at Sitka. On a cool morning in Sitka, Port workers watched a ferry ease through Sitka Sound while gulls traced slow circles overhead. The vessel's horn rolled over water that smelled of kelp and diesel and early rain. Among the manifested arrivals, one name would reportedly remain unanswered at the terminal doors. People wheeled bags across wet pavement while radio traffic clicked and paused around the ramp. The absence did not ring alarms first, it only lingered as a missing footstep in a practiced routine. The passenger, listed as Charles Weaver, was 62, a retired accountant from Spokane traveling to Sitka to visit his younger sister. He had boarded at Juneau 2 nights earlier, carrying one rolling suitcase and a canvas daypack. A purser noted his quiet demeanor and a habit of reading schedules taped beside stairwells. State records list his height, his gray hair, and an emergency contact with a Washington area code. His purpose in Sitka was simple. He planned to help arrange minor repairs at a family rental. The crew roster that week included a junior deckhand named Ian, 27, who worked nights cleaning rails and checking life rings. He remembered a man matching Weaver's description standing alone near the stern during the long run south. The wind carried spray and conversation toward the cafeteria, where lights stayed warm through the small hours. Some travelers slept against windows, while others played cards near vending machines that hummed against the bulkhead. Ian said he noticed the man review a folded map, then pocket it when the aisle cleared. Dispatch logs from the terminal record the arrival time at dawn, with light rain sweeping across Baranof Island. The ramp grounded against the apron, and trucks rolled off while several pedestrians gathered under a metal awning. A clerk scanned barcodes as passengers filed past a yellow line where a guard checked random bags. The logs show a brief power flicker in the terminal hall, then a reset that lasted under 1 minute. No incident codes were assigned, and operations resumed without delay or comment. Weaver's sister reached the terminal late after a stalled school zone detour near Sawmill Creek Road. She parked near the chain-link fence and watched the last pedestrians scatter toward taxis and waiting relatives. By her account, the rain slowed and a mist sat low across Crescent Harbor. She checked her phone and called twice. Without success, the calls rang without answer, and times were stamped in her provider records. She later told officers she felt uneasy without any specific reason beyond a silence that extended past habit. When baggage carts emptied, a single gray suitcase circled on the belt with no claimant stepping forward to lift it away. The tag matched Weaver's name and routing, printed in black on a laminated slip. A terminal agent moved the suitcase behind a counter and wrote a simple note on a clipboard. No alarm was triggered because unclaimed luggage appears with predictable frequency on rainy mornings. The agent set the suitcase on a shelf and returned to help a couple searching for a misplaced fishing rod. Archived notes taken that afternoon indicate officers spoke separately with 2 travelers who remembered a man fitting the description. One was an art teacher from Sitka who sketched whales from the solarium during the night hours. She recalled the man leaning on the rail near Mount Edgecombe's faint outline when clouds parted for a moment. Another was a mechanic from Ketchikan who said the same man bought coffee twice and asked about taxi prices in town. Investigators never confirmed the timing with receipts, and no surveillance covered the solarium benches. The county file from 2009 in a separate missing traveler case shows a similar pattern of unclaimed baggage and unclear disembarkation. That earlier file included a ferry manifest, a terminal sweep, and door checks against wind gusts that sometimes move latches. It also noted how passengers occasionally exit through service doors when following crew in reflective jackets. In that instance, the traveler was located later at a motel near a cannery road after walking away in heavy rain. Investigators compared the patterns, yet the Sitka details failed to line up cleanly. Ferry officers reviewed internal access logs for closed stairwells that connect vehicle decks and passenger spaces. They found no anomalies, only routine entries by maintenance staff checking bilge alarms and a cleaner replacing paper towels. A camera near the cafeteria recorded partial views of faces during meal hours but missed the corridor leading to the aft lounge. Reviewers watched the files twice and logged timestamps at 5-minute intervals to mark movement clusters. Some locals claimed an extra gap appeared near the end of the recording, yet technicians reported no dropped frames. At midweek, state records show officers walked the shoreline on both sides of the terminal looking for disturbed kelp lines. The tide had fallen quickly after the ferry's docking, leaving slick rocks and sand flecked with broken shells. They checked ladders, pilings, and fenders for fibers or scuffs that might indicate contact with clothing or bags. A harbor patrol boat swept the inner channel while rain stiffened from the south and visibility narrowed along the hills. Nothing turned up beyond a hat band caught on a cleat that belonged to someone else. Weaver's phone connected briefly to a tower outside town at a time that conflicted with the expected walk-off window. Analysts plotted pings against ferry timetables and decided the reading could reflect device drift under poor weather. A later attempt to triangulate from neighboring towers gave no additional certainty for the immediate period following docking. The device never registered a data session in Sitka proper, and voicemail remained unchanged for several days. The phone was eventually found powered down inside the gray suitcase held behind the terminal counter. When officers opened the suitcase with the sisters' consent, they found clothing folded tightly and a small bottle of vitamins. There was also a spiral notebook with mileage notes and simple arithmetic tracking gas costs for earlier segments of travel. A handwritten list named tasks in Sitka, including a visit to a plumbing supplier and a stop at a family storage unit. Nothing suggested immediate plans beyond errands that fit a short visit. The day pack remained missing, and no one recalled seeing it after the ship's cafeteria closed for the night. A taxi dispatcher reportedly checked logs and found no record of a pickup under Weaver's name during the docking hour. Drivers sometimes accept cash riders who wave at the curb, which complicates documentation on wet mornings when lines are short. One driver remembered a man stepping toward the curb, then turning away while fastening his jacket. The driver could not establish the face, and weather limited the view through the windshield that kept fogging despite the fan. The report noted the uncertainty without assigning weight, and the lead stayed open. Some locals claimed the man left the ship early through a service door when the deckhands repositioned chocks around wheel wells. Crew statements conflicted on door status because procedures allow short openings during shifts and quick closures afterward. A safety officer said those doors close against air pressure that resists casual pushes from the outside. He added that wind can trick hinges and create sounds that resemble latches when traffic moves on the ramp. Investigators never confirmed external access during that window, and the theory remained a line in the file. Searchers walked the footpath toward Totem Park, checking benches and thickets where travelers sometimes paused to adjust bags. Rain lifted briefly, and a weak sun set bands of silver across Sitka Sound, while ravens scolded from cedar branches. A groundskeeper reported no new camps or discarded bottles that would suggest a hasty stop. Officers spoke with staff at a nearby cafe who said the morning trade moved quickly with fishermen and hospital employees. No one recalled a man drip-drying near the heater or holding a map with ferry schedules. The sister called relatives in Washington and asked about any change of plans that might redirect the visit. None were reported, and bank activity remained consistent with a careful traveler who used small cash purchases along the route. A credit card charge at Juneau showed a ferry cafeteria meal during a schedule break between legs. There were no Sitka charges and no attempts at withdrawals from machines that dripped onto the pavement near the lot. The pattern suggested momentum toward Sitka, then a full stop without financial movement afterward. Investigators checked hospitals and clinics for admissions, matching Weaver's age and description during the week after arrival. No patient aligned with his file, and air ambulance logs listed unrelated cases tied to remote villages and fishing accidents. The harbormaster distributed a brief notice to smaller docks asking attendants to report unattended bags. A trooper walked through a gear shop and asked about any customer who seemed lost or wet beyond the usual rain. Staff could not connect the details to a specific person, and the inquiry ended without a lead. A month later, a hiker on a trail above the Indian River claimed to see a jacket sleeve tangled near a root. Officers climbed the slope and found a torn piece of nylon that had weathered through 2 storm cycles. Fabric comparators could not match the weave to Weaver's clothing because the suitcase sample lacked similar material. The location strained the timeline given the docking hour and the limited paths out of the terminal. The note entered the file under unverified observation and did not change the working summary. When analysts wrote their concluding memo, they listed elements that aligned with a simple failure to disembark through the usual doors. They paired those with elements that resisted such a reading, including the phone found later with no tower contact in Sitka. They added a paragraph on ferry architecture and how movement patterns complicate any reconstruction when cameras leave gaps between spaces. A final section summarized the sister's persistent calls and her quiet visits to the shoreline in the weeks following. The memo ended with language indicating records conflict and that the absence remains without a confirmed path. Years later, the terminal agent remembered the morning every time an unclaimed bag circled the belt after a rainy docking. The memory did not carry definitive images, only small impressions tied to radio clicks and the short flicker in the hall. State records continued to list Weaver as missing, with a note that he was last associated with a scheduled ferry arrival. The file stayed active in annual audits and drew brief attention whenever travelers asked about old cases related to the route. Nothing further emerged, and the routine at the dock moved on with gulls and diesel and rain. The stories. Why this motel room safe changed everything. They called it a budget motel along a long highway spur, where road dust gathered in corners and secrets settled quietly. The room safe in number 12 looked ordinary enough, powder-coated steel with a keypad that beeped politely at tired travelers. Lyle Garza woke before sunrise on a Tuesday, 38 years old, and working claims for a regional insurer. He had driven 3 hours to meet a policyholder whose pickup had burned behind the old diner, and he wanted clean paperwork today. He checked into the motel first, showered fast, then laid out forms on the dresser, careful about matching VIN digits and timestamps. His plan was simple: wrap the inspection before lunch, then circle back for photos and voice notes after the truck release. He liked driving while the day still felt open, and he told himself the assignment would be routine and forgettable. It had been forgettable until the manager knocked. 2 quick raps, then a pause heavy enough to make him frown. Mara Quintero stood in the doorway with a clipboard, 34, managing rooms and payroll while raising her nephew after school. She asked if he had heard the beeps from the safe, because front desk saw brief power spikes last night. Lyle said he had not used the safe, and she nodded, eyes moving toward the keypad like someone checking a stove twice. Maintenance had logged an odd complaint the previous afternoon. Reportedly, a guest in 12 claimed the safe ate his wallet. The man left before checkout, promising to call the card companies, and a note in the margin said possible intoxication. Mara said housekeeping later pulled the bedding and found a small metal tool near the baseboard. Lyle picked up the tool carefully with a tissue, a thin square of steel with a notch like a feeler gauge. He set it on the desk with his forms, then opened his voice recorder, speaking in that steady tone he used for field notes. He described the room, the safe brand, the tool, and the time on the microwave clock because simple details held steady on lonely days. Mara asked if he knew how to clear the safe code since the master sheet had gone missing during renovations last winter. He did not, but he knew the trick of powering off consumer locks, which could flip hidden defaults, according to a warehouse supervisor he once interviewed. He unplugged the mini fridge, found the breaker panel behind a painting, then asked permission to shut the room briefly. They stood in the doorway while the lights flickered, and the highway hummed like a restless air conditioner beyond the lot. He waited 10 seconds, restored power, then tapped the keypad with a ballpoint, feeling silly and a little curious. The safe beeped twice in a lower tone, which he recognized from a training video about apartment lockouts, reportedly used by traveling warranty teams. He tried a factory code that someone had once mumbled during a fire inspection, and the safe chirped, green light winking. The door opened an inch against a sticky seal, and Mara let out a nervous laugh, surprised and worried in equal measure. Inside sat a clear zipper pouch with a folded receipt, a motel keycard from another town, and a small black voice recorder. He found a driver loyalty card attached to the receipt, and he read the printed name softly without repeating it twice. The dates lined up with last week in neat columns, and the purchase list looked like roadside dinners between midnight and 2. He asked Mara if the guest from yesterday had paid cash, and she nodded, then reached for the phone to check archived calls. The front desk handset kept scratchy tapes by default, a habit from the previous owner who never trusted software invoices. She played a call stamped at 2 in the morning, where a tired voice asked for room 12, mentioning a late delivery and stiff back. Another call at 2:30 asked about vending, and a third at 4 asked if nobody would bother him until noon. Lyle switched to evidence mode, careful and methodical, letting his coffee cool while he cataloged the pouch contents. He photographed the safe before moving anything, then called his supervisor to report an unexpected discovery unrelated to the truck claim. The supervisor told him to act reasonably and preserve anything with identifiable information, then to keep his focus on the scheduled inspection. He listened to the voice recorder after asking Mara to stay within earshot, since 2 listeners felt wiser than 1 on strange mornings. The first file held roadway noise, then a quiet tone of someone rehearsing directions, same room number repeated like a sticky thought. The second file was shorter, a man saying he could not keep doing this and that she would understand once it was delivered safely. He paused to note the words safely, which felt pointed given the open door and the blinking keypad. He bagged the recorder in a zip bag from his kit, then checked the keycard from the other town, which was stamped with a lion logo. Mara recognized the chain and said there was a property 30 miles north, mostly used by truckers and medical travelers. He returned the room to normal and headed for the burned truck with his camera bag, but his plan had started to wobble. The pickup sat behind a towing yard fence, soot clinging thick to the firewall, while melted wires drooped like tired ivy. He worked the usual grid of photos, then the odometer and the cargo bed, then cross-reference with dispatch notes he had requested by email. The fire report smelled like common engine loss, not sabotage, and he felt relief settle along his shoulders as the cause narrowed. He dictated measurements and closed the laptop, then looked at his watch and thought about the safe again and the trembling voice. He felt a nudge of duty that had nothing to do with premiums, and he drove back to the motel through heat that made the road shimmer. Mara met him with a printout of last night guests, which listed an alias that matched the loyalty card name partly. The address field showed a mail drop location, familiar to freight drivers who rolled through without a fixed base. She said a long white tractor had idled near the ice machine last night, according to a neighbor who called about fumes after midnight. He asked for the neighbor number, then listened to a careful woman describe a man in a reflective jacket with a limp. She said he stayed near room 12 door, not inside, as if waiting for someone to arrive quietly or leave quickly. She heard 2 quiet knocks around 3, and a soft voice answered, then a cart rattle like someone moving luggage without wheels. Lyle opened the pouch again and noticed a handwritten code on the receipt back, 4 digits and a messy star next to it. He tried the code on the safe, and the delay light flashed, which often meant an old user lockout or a wrong sequence. He snapped a photo and lowered the door, then rolled the notched tool between his fingers, a weight that felt borrowed from someone patient. He thought about a repairman he had interviewed in 2019 who taught him that thieves love patterns more than courage. The man said patterns live in receipts, tolls, and vending logs, because tired people seek familiar sandwiches and coffee brands. Lyle searched the loyalty program website on his phone, typed the partial name and 4 digits, and got a generic profile with travel points. The profile showed recent redemptions listed by city, and he wrote them on a notepad, then drew lines between dates and approximate routes. The cities formed a loop around distribution centers, with brief pauses near hospitals and bulk pharmacy hubs according to public maps. He felt his heart step faster as the voice recorder line about delivered safely nudged his thoughts toward the quiet side of medicine. He told Mara he would drive north to the Lion Logo Motel for a quick visit, and she insisted on calling ahead politely. The clerk up there skimmed her stay sheets and mentioned a forgotten envelope last week, found under a mattress frame during turnover. The envelope held nothing when housekeeping retrieved it, but a corner showed marks from a rubber band, reportedly stretched tight. He reached the northern property by mid-afternoon, watched trucks rock gently in wind, and asked for the manager on duty. A tall man with tired eyes met him in the lobby, said a nurse had asked about a lost pouch 3 nights ago. She wore a badge from a staffing agency, spoke quickly, and left a number that went to voicemail full by morning. The manager allowed a quick look at the lost and found cabinet, which contained phone chargers, a chipped mug, 3 lanyards, and a plastic bag with an empty pharmacy sticker peeled halfway. Lyle photographed the bag and wrote the former label number carefully, then stepped into the parking lot to call a friend in compliance he trusted. The friend checked a public database of recalls and shortages, then told him to consider the rise in small clinical thefts along transport corridors. He returned to his car and replayed the second audio file, hearing the way the man swallowed hard between sentences. The phrase "delivered safely" stuck again, and he wondered if safely meant to someone specific, not to a warehouse or anonymous shelf. He drove back to the first motel with a plan forming, not quite a theory, but a set of steps that could either untangle or embarrass him. He asked Mara for permission to review last week camera footage that covered the breezeway near room 12, and she agreed. The feed was old, grainy, and stamped with the wrong date, since nobody reset it after storms in 2015. Still, silhouettes moved clearly enough. And at 3:12, a figure in a reflective jacket appeared with a short, careful stride. The figure waited near the door, then crouched to slide something under, then stood fast as another figure approached from the stairwell. The second person carried a rolling cart with a blanket thrown over, which hung low enough to hide a small cooler shape. They exchanged a short handshake, then rolled the cart toward the soda machine area, where cameras always blinked with static. Lyle paused the frame and sketched the handshake position, because small, consistent gestures tied people to habits when faces stayed hidden. He compared the notebook times to the archived calls, matching the neighbor report with the footage minute stamp nearly exactly. He folded his notes and looked at Mara, who watched quietly with the clipboard held like a shield against a sudden chill. He called the non-emergency line and asked to speak with property crimes, then explained he was an adjuster who found items in a room safe. He said the items might connect to an ongoing pattern, not a single incident, and that he was available to hand them over cleanly. The dispatcher thanked him and routed the call, and he kept his voice steady while explaining that nobody was hurt today. The detective who arrived wore a tie gone soft at the edges, a man who had seen this exact motel a dozen times. He took the pouch, the recorder, and copies of the photos, then asked Lyle to explain the breaker trick and the code attempts. He nodded at the handshake frame and said a group had moved product along back roads for months, staying under dollar thresholds on purpose. Lyle asked quietly if product meant medicine, and the detective said people cut solutions with water and resold to small clinics. In some stories, the clinics were victims with forged orders, and in others, they were partners, trying to stretch short supplies like taffy. The man in the reflector jacket likely ran deliveries for cash while hauling legal freight, which made tracing routes messy and confusing. The detective listened to the voice files twice, then looked at the loyalty redemptions and circled 2 cities with his pen. He said the phrase "delivered safely" could mean to a person at a care home who could not pay official prices anymore. The pouch might have served as a drop signal, and the room safe might have held a stopgap in case someone panicked. They took statements from Mara and the neighbor by phone, and the manager at the northern property sent a scanned copy of his notes. The detective collected the notch tool and said it was standard for bypassing cam locks, which matched a series of quiet thefts from vending. He asked Lyle to write a formal summary of his steps, meticulous and dated, and to expect a follow-up if a warrant landed later. Lyle finished the paper part in his room, breathing slow while light crept through the blinds in a warm, tired stripe. He wrote down the way the safe beeped twice after power restoration, which suggested a default that any one patient could eventually find. He wrote the route loop and the hospital adjacency, and he wrote the voice phrasing exactly because transcription mattered when memories warped. He closed his laptop and stared at the open safe like it wanted to be ordinary again, silent and blank and light. He felt that shift people talk about when routine work bends into something it has no business touching on a weekday. He thought about honest clinics, rationing doses, then about someone paying cash at 3 in the morning because a parent cried. At dusk, the detective called back and said a unit found the white tractor idling near a different budget property downtown. The driver had the same chain lanyard from the lost and found cabinet, and his phone contained notes about room safes by brand. He reportedly told officers he was only a messenger and that someone else handled actual swapping and dilution. which sounded flat and practiced. Lyle listened quietly and said he would be available if a deposition request arrived. Then he sat with the keycard on the dresser. He knew he would remember the feel of that notched tool because it had a purpose-built patience that felt personal. He knew he would remember the cheap beep of the safe and the way a single small space changed the line of his day. A week later, he got an email from the detective, brief and measured, thanking him for the timeline and the careful photos. The message said the pouch had traces of saline and a label adhesive compound common to medical packaging of a certain class. The voice on the recorder matched a man pulled over near a way station, according to dispatch logs and an archived booking photo. Lyle drove back to the motel after closing another case, and he asked Mara how business felt since the long Tuesday. She said people still stopped for highway rest, and she tightened a few procedures quietly, preferring to let small changes speak. She now kept master codes in a locked drawer and replaced 3 aging safes with models that logged attempts for a full week. They stood in room 12 a moment, like visitors paying respects to an inanimate witness that never blinked. The safe sat closed and calm, doing exactly what a box was meant to do, which felt both reassuring and strange. He signed the receipt for his stay, then shook her hand, and promised to bring better stories next time through. On the drive home, he thought about the phrase delivered safely again and how words can hide more than they reveal. He wondered how many small transactions keep the world running, good and bad, unremarkable and decisive, stacked behind quiet doors. He decided the safe had not made him heroic or special, it had only reminded him that dull edges can cut when pressure builds. He kept working claims, taking pictures of bent bumpers and damp carpet, writing notes with careful times and plain language. He still believed that truth likes details, and that details prefer patient notebooks, not flashy speeches or clever hunches. When he thought about that Tuesday, he did not think about danger or chase lights. He thought about how a box opened and a day veered left. Mara hired another housekeeper and bought a better cart, one that glided without rattling near cameras and soda machines. She laughed more at the front desk now, but her eyes still checked keys and codes before she turned off the lights. She told her nephew that small routines matter, like counting towels and returning clipboards, because order resists the creep of careless luck. The detective moved on to other cases and sent one last note months later, carefully worded, acknowledging ongoing court schedules. He wrote that the room-safe discovery had clarified timing between suspects, which helped align witness statements with fuel receipts precisely. He added a line about public hearings scheduled for late next spring, where facts would hopefully land on paper clearly. The motel kept renting room 12 to travelers who wanted ground-level convenience and an easy walk to the ice. The safe held wallets and passports and nothing dramatic for a while, which suited everyone whose name stayed off any report. The highway kept pouring itself past the parking lot, and the night clerk kept coffee hot for anyone who needed comfort. Lyle sometimes thought about stopping by without a claim, just to buy a soda and wave at the office through dusty glass. He pictured the safe blinking quietly in that square of afternoon sun, as if practicing for whatever day came next. He accepted that the box had not changed him completely, but it had polished a habit he already valued deeply. He looked back on it like a narrow bridge he crossed safely, not a legend, just a real span over a quiet creek. He had listened, he had written, he had looked twice, and he had taken small steps that lined up neatly. That felt like enough for a life that preferred steady roads to loud headlines, and it still does. The stories. Night Guard, who followed footprints beyond the bridge. The first prints showed on a cold night when the river smoked and the closed bridge let out a slow iron groan. Frost held the gravel in a crust, so every step someone took across the municipal yard snapped like thin glass. Merrick Holland worked nights because he liked quiet places and because the warehouse paid overtime when storms rolled in. He was 41 by the last week of January, and he kept his thermos on the dash while he did his rounds. His plan was simple that night. Check the north fence. Check the generator shed. Sign the log before dawn and head home on the empty road. He saw the prints on his second pass, and their path made little sense when he stood still to study them. The footprints curved toward the pedestrian bridge that crossed the narrow river, which had been closed since late autumn while crews waited on parts. A chain link panel barred the entrance with a sign that warned about unsafe decking, and Marek knew the sign by heart. He radioed the dispatcher with a routine note, since procedure made repeaters of careful guards. He kept his words easy. He said there were footprints where there should be none, and that he would check closer. The reply was scratchy and bored, and Marek almost laughed at the familiar tone. The treads were small and tidy, like work boots with a diamond pattern, and each step pressed the frost to a dark oval. The prince went right up to the chain link panel, then slipped under at a low spot where someone had pulled wire loose. Marek knelt and touched the ground, and cold shot through his glove while he reset the bent ties. He peered down the dark shape of the bridge and decided he would not walk out there in the cold wind, not without telling someone first. He called again, then kept his flashlight tight to the decking while he stepped forward, and he felt the bridge vibrate under his boots. He moved slow because he always moved slow when he could choose between slow and fast. Halfway across, the prince turned to powder as the frost thinned, and he had to scan both sides for scuffs on the gray boards. He found a faint line where grit had dragged, like something heavy had been pulled by rope. On the far side, the deck ended at a set of concrete steps that dropped to the river path, and here the prince deepened again. They pointed left, past an old pipe cradle and a low stand of scrub willow. Reports in the fall had mentioned fishers along the bank after hours, which was normal, and a few had been moved along without trouble. A clerk at the gas station had told an officer that a man bought batteries and duct tape in the same visit, which was normal enough, though people sometimes remember strange details when asked at night. Dispatch logs showed power dips near the intake station from time to time, and maintenance had chalked that up to loose connections in cold weather. Marek followed the prince along the river path until they vanished near a patch of bare gravel that the sun struck most days, even in winter. He stood there and listened. Somewhere upstream, an owl made 3 soft calls, and a semi rolled past on the highway with a roar that shook the willow branches. He decided he had gone far enough for one night. He photographed the prince on his phone and headed back, and he wrote a careful note in the log before dawn. By the next shift, the frost lifted late, and the yard lights burned a clean white circle on the gravel. Marek checked the generator shed first and noticed something he could not shake. The small lock on the diesel cap was scuffed, and a scratch ran from the cap to the lip like a hose had rubbed while someone steadied a weight. He checked the fuel slip from the last delivery and did the quick math. The level looked low by a few gallons, which could happen, and which also could not. He spoke with Celia Karp in maintenance the following afternoon because Celia knew more about the place than anyone in the office. Celia was 58 and had worked 3 floods and 2 droughts, and she kept a pocket notebook with every code for every panel. She said the power dips had been shrugged off by city, and that nobody had time to pull the panels until spring. She said the bridge closure made her nervous because blocked paths invite shortcuts. On the 3rd night, Marek went to the bridge before his first pass, and he crouched at the chain link panel with a small bag of sidewalk chalk from the supply closet. He rubbed a pinch of red chalk into the dirt under the gap and dusted the decking where the prince had scuffed before. He wanted a way to tell if someone crossed again, and he wanted to see where the dust went when the night did its work. He made his rounds slower than usual and kept his eyes on corners where things hide without trying. The radio remained quiet until midnight. Then a call came in about a coyote by the south gate. Marek drove down and found only wind, and he thought the call felt like a joke he had heard before. He logged it anyway, because logs are the bones of quiet jobs. When he returned to the bridge, his light caught the faintest red sunset on the boards, and he felt alert in the way he liked. The chalk had smeared in a thin line toward the far steps, and the dust trailed down to the river path. On the gravel, small red flecks marked an arc that led behind a stack of old culvert pipe where few people bothered to look. He moved closer and found a cooler wedged inside a culvert mouth, and an inverter buzzed inside like a tired hornet. A length of clear hose lay coiled by the cooler, and the nozzle had a strip of duct tape where a leak had been patched. The setup looked temporary and careful, like someone trusted routine more than luck. Marek called dispatch, and his voice stayed even while he chose words that would not set hairs on necks. An officer drove down the service road and met him by the culvert, and they stood and listened together. The officer did not rush, which Marek respected, and the two men watched the bridge until the wind shifted. The officer said he would put a note on the morning brief, and he asked Marek to keep eyes open without playing hero. The phrase made Marek smile, and later he did not tell that part to anyone. In the days after, Marek traced the quiet pattern that repeats when someone abuses access. He checked camera angles and discovered the North Yard camera had been bumped on a date that matched a power dip, and the new angle showed the sky more than the gate. He opened the back of the housing and found 3 screws missing, which was always a tell. He measured the footprints with a scrap of tape and got the same length each time, which told him the walker was careful with steps or else was one person always. He walked to the diner 2 blocks away during the afternoon and chatted with the cook named Huxley, who knew every vehicle that rolled through after midnight. Huxley said a man in a dark jacket sat late 2 nights a week, always with a single cup of coffee and a pocket radio on the booth seat. Huxley said the man tipped exact change and left when the freight trains crossed the river, which happened near the time Marion Street patrol cars swapped shifts. At the yard, a temporary guard from an agency had been filling 2 nights that Mark traded away for overtime on weekends. The temp signed the log with 2 letters and a quick crooked line. The initials were H and P, which matched about 1,000 people and which could match none. Marek did not care for suspicion as a hobby, yet he did not care for coincidences when fuel levels fell in quiet inches. He sat in his sedan before shift and went through old notes in his glove box where he kept manuals and photocopies. A contractor named Deacon Varelli had lost access in 2017 after a billing fight, and his crew had worked the intake station on that very river path for years. Marek wrote the name on a small card, then tossed the card at once, because names can lead you down the wrong hall. He kept his attention on the temp schedule instead, and he compared logs against the chalk nights and the reported coyote calls. On a dry Tuesday, red chalk showed again on the gravel, and the cooler in the culvert had moved 2 feet, which looked like a nervous person trying to outsmart the obvious. Marek called the non-emergency number and asked for a quiet presence, and officers waited with their lights low behind the old salt shed. Marek did his rounds with wide loops and checked his watch without seeming to check, and he waited on the near side of the bridge by the chain link panel. A figure came over the crest like a shadow that had business, and the boots set down in precise little ovals. The man wore a dark jacket with reflective piping like the agency issued, and he carried a duffel that sagged from weight. Marek stepped forward and kept his light on the ground, and he spoke steady without trying to sound like an actor. He said the bridge was closed by order of city, and he asked if help was needed. The man froze and looked left toward the culvert, which told Marek the only thing he really needed to know. The officers stepped from behind the shed, and everything stayed dull and true from there. The duffel held a 12-volt pump, a power bank, and 2 hoses cut to different lengths. The cooler held the inverter and spare tape and a stack of empty hand warmers, which can keep batteries alive just long enough between dips. The generator diesel cap carried the same tape residue as the hose, which tied the loop neatly enough for any careful mind. In the report that later circulated, details sat plain without flourish, which is how such documents talk to the world. The temp guard was named Harley Pruitt, age 36, and he had worked a roster of small night jobs that rewarded boredom more than skill. Archived calls showed he had reported animal movement at the south gate on the nights when the pump likely ran, which kept eyes away from the river path. Store security footage from across the highway reportedly showed a man matching his build, buying duct tape and batteries on a schedule that matched power dips at the intake station. Celia came down with a wrench the following morning and replaced the generator cap, and she tightened every panel on every camera while humming through her teeth. She shook Marek's hand with hard gratitude, and she told him the thing she always tells the new ones. Quiet places are never empty, and attention is the difference between a close call and a cleanup. People in town talked for a day, and then they talked about weather and games and a boat stuck on the ramp. Marek logged his shift and ran a cloth across the dusty dash, and he looked once at the bridge where the chain link panel still hung crooked. He felt a small weight lift, which felt almost like pride, and then he felt something more like relief. He went back to the prints in his head, and he ran the path out again from the first night to the last. The steps had led beyond the bridge in the way tracks tell their whole story, and the red chalk had given him a quiet mouth. He thought about the way a small problem can hide inside a larger closure, and how a closed bridge invites someone to think rules are only suggestion. He drove the empty road home before dawn, and the river threw thin fog across the low bend like quiet breath. Merrick did not decide to keep working nights forever, and he did not make any grand vow. He thought instead about the small habits that keep a place honest, and the way a single set of prints can reveal a patient plan. In a town that prefers routine, a careful person with time can pull things apart slowly, unless another careful person keeps watch and asks simple questions that carry weight. By spring, the bridge opened again with new planks that smelled like fresh-cut pine, and families leaned on the rail to watch geese slide by. Some people remember a rumor when they cross, while most only hear water and light traffic and the chatter of kids. Merrick crosses when his route calls for it, and he never looks for drama, though he notices scuffs out of habit and checks if gates sit straight. He keeps chalk in the glove box still, and he keeps a small card that reminds him that attention wins more often than luck. The card does not carry a name, and it does not need one, because the lesson was simple and dull and true. He followed footprints beyond a bridge that everyone ignored, and he found a tidy machine made for taking small pieces of a place that trusted silence. Quiet work gave him back a little faith, which is worth more on a night shift than any badge or speech. When people ask him why he noticed, Marek says it was the shape of the morning frost and the numbers that never add fair. He tells them he just kept walking where the prince asked him to go, and he wrote things down when they mattered. He says a bridge is still a path even when closed, and that someone will use that fact to their advantage at least once. The rest of the time, he does not say much, and he lets the town hold its small stories without fuss, because most of them end with someone paying attention and returning what does not belong to them. The stories. These archived tapes were a warning at the lake. The county kept a box of old tapes that nobody requested, though people mentioned a lake in half the labels. Each reel carried a handwritten date in faded ink, spanning from 1984 through 2001, then stopping abruptly. Rena Valdez was 34, a county records technician who covered the public window and handled the backroom shelves. She had planned a quick shift, then a quiet drive to her sister's apartment for leftover stew and television. The box of tapes ruined that plan because the new intern stacked it crookedly, and the lid slid open suddenly. One cardboard sleeve read Lake Patrol. Another said Ranger Tower 2. The thickest sleeve said Dispatch Saturdays. A note at the bottom said duplicates for training, reportedly returned after audit, do not discard. The dates matched a period locals still referenced with nervous jokes, which meant details might still identify private people. She logged the box in a generic way, using the Lakeshore District and a wide date range to protect identities. She told herself it would wait until Monday, then she found herself winding a reel on the library machine. The machine clicked softly, and a voice filled the tiny playback room, thin and metallic. The first tape was a ranger briefing about posted signs and seasonal closures, and nothing seemed strange at first hearing. A man listed wind patterns, then a woman read names for volunteer cleanups, and then someone said maintenance reported missing bolts on the north dock. The voice added that the bolts were not stripped, they were removed carefully without damaging the boards. A second tape included a dispatcher answering calls about diesel sheen near the old boat ramp. According to the label, fishermen reported a smell like hot plastic, and a teenager reported chain rattling under the planks after dark. The dispatcher kept people calm while advising them to stick to lit areas and avoid the roped section. Rena paused the machine and wrote notes in her spiral, keeping each line factual with times and initials. She checked the storage log for incident reports from those dates, and the log showed vague entries about routine patrol and no injuries. It seemed like a cluster of small maintenance problems, which did not explain the careful script on the warning sleeves. She switched reels, and a new voice took over, quieter and closer to the microphone. The label said Saturdays 2, with a date from 1991 in shaky handwriting and a stamped number. The voice mentioned archived calls about chain noises again, and added that footprints led down the roped section in soft silt. Someone in the room asked about weather, and the answer was light wind, clear night, no boats scheduled after sunset. The voice then read a memo that asked rangers to log all interactions with a particular vendor near the snack stand. It said, "Do not escalate, document demeanor, and confirm hours against posted permits," using a separate clipboard. Rena recognized the clipboard instruction style, which matched old county risk templates for potential liability tracking. Vendors generated paperwork when things went sideways, especially near open water with kids, which made steady documentation crucial later. Still, the tapes kept circling the same triangle of dock bolts, chain noises, and the roped section. She printed a map from the binder with blank labels, then drew a tidy triangle between the dock, the snack stand, and the ranger tower. The map helped her visualize lines of sight, and she started marking places with little asterisks for maintenance incidents. The roped section sat slightly east, hidden from the snack stand by cottonwoods, which mattered for visibility. Another reel played a clipped exchange where a ranger told dispatch that a gate lock appeared new and unregistered. The ranger added that cones were moved and a laminated warning sign had clean nail holes without rust. The dispatcher asked for photos, and the answer was already taken and copied for the folder labeled permits. The next tape changed tone with a shaky breath before an officer started reading notes into the recorder deliberately. He said witnesses reported a loud splash near midnight, then a truck engine idling on the far turnout. He said tracks showed heavy tread, then lighter footsteps heading back alone, and a partial plate was recorded without certainty. Rena stopped and checked the case index, trying to locate an incident number referencing a midnight splash during that month. The index only showed a maintenance order for replacing stolen chain and a request for more reflective tape. She underlined the lack of a matching incident and added a small arrow to her running list for later verification. On Tuesday morning, she asked her supervisor if she could inventory the box more thoroughly since the reels were fragile. He nodded without interest, telling her to log whatever needed logging and to shove the box behind tax rolls. That gave her private time in the playback room, which she used to build a timeline on fresh paper. She listened to another Saturday tape where a woman from the tower called dispatch about a boat drifting across the boundary. The boat moved lazily, but the line drifted toward the roped section, which was posted as no entry. The woman sounded firm, and she logged the time. Then she asked for a ranger with a bullhorn. A tiny clink echoed on the tape before a second voice said, "Hold on," then added that a chain was loosened again. The tower watched two shapes bending by the boundary floats, and the dispatcher repeated the request for immediate response. Sirens filtered faintly through the recorder, then the tape ended with an abrupt click that did not feel accidental. Rena checked the log again and found only a note about routine lake closure with citation for boundary violation. She highlighted the citation number and scribbled a request to pull the paper copy from the offsite cabinet. If the citation sheet had officer notes, she might find names replaced with initials and a vendor detail. In the afternoon, the intern returned with coffee, and Rena asked if he knew the lake from hiking around. He said his cousins called it the turnaround because teens use the far turnout to swap drivers late at night. He said people heard the chain in the wind and joked that it meant a shift change for the lake. She asked about the vendor by the snack stand, and he shrugged, saying an older guy sold bait from a cooler. He added that the man kept to himself, and that the stand closed after 2003 when bathrooms needed repair. Rena thanked him, then went back to the machine, because one more reel had Ranger Tower 2 in heavy ink. The reel opened with playful teasing about coffee. Then a woman said the boundary floats were drifting again toward the shallow shelf. She made a note that the vendor stayed late, counting cash, and that 3 pickup trucks idled by the turnout. She said wind from the ridge pushed small waves against the dock posts, and the sound carried. Then came a gentle thud, and the woman said quietly that bolt heads were missing again on the north ladder. She asked anyone nearby to bring a camera and mentioned small shavings near the posts, like metal caught and ground shiny. She said it looked new, not weathered, and suggested logging it as tampering after checking permits. Rena wrote ladder bolt heads missing and circled the phrase carefully, then drew a line to the earlier chain note. She felt the outline of something organized, not merely bad luck, and the tapes added a pattern of late Saturdays. She felt a pinch of frustration because the official paper trail looked deliberately harmless compared to the recordings. She filed a request to review tower logs that year, and the clerk gave her a battered binder with loose pages. The tower logs used pencil, and the Saturday pages looked smudged, but several entries repeated a vendor name pattern. The pattern matched the earlier instruction to log demeanor and hours, which meant quiet escalation without confrontation. An evening tape from 2001 began with static. Then the dispatcher said the tower line would record summaries every hour. The tower voice read weather, then listed vehicles, then paused at a truck with a partially obscured plate covered by dust. The tower added that the truck bed held a heavy chain coiled flat and the ends taped tight. Rena felt the air in the room go thin, though she knew she was just listening to old caution collected for audits. The tower voice kept going, steady and calm, calling out 2 sets of footsteps and 1 pair returning alone toward the turnout. Then the tower said the vendor appeared nervous, closing early and locking a cooler with a new padlock. Another reel documented a ranger walking the roped section at dawn, taking photos of raw scrapes on chain links. The ranger said the scrapes were bright, not dull, and the boundary floats had new gouges near the welded rings. He guessed someone had dragged the chain to the shelf, making deep channels beside the ladder posts. She studied the map again, measuring distances with the edge of a note card and aligning the triangle to the shoreline. The shelf sat where the cold current ran channel to channel, sucking down loose gear and stunned fish every spring. If someone knew that flow, they could use it to hide things quickly, maybe even move something heavy without splashing. The county maintained a box of anonymous tips from that period, and Rena requested the file through the clerk quietly. The tips mentioned fights in the turnout, and a truck with fresh dents, and late-night cash counting by the stand. One tip described a crying woman near the chain in 1991, then wrote, "He told her to get in now." Rena breathed slowly and kept her notes clinical, because she was not a detective and the tapes were not a case file. She wrote potential domestic dispute near boundary, then wrote check for missing persons in overlapping county dates. She cross-referenced the years against a public list of unresolved reports, without printing names or addresses. Within that public list, several families had posted memorial pages that mentioned the lake vaguely without pinning a location. The dates brushed the Saturday span, and at least one message thanked volunteers who had searched old drainage channels. Rena did not draw conclusions, but she felt the box had been kept near the window for a reason. The thickest reel contained a training segment that sounded like a quiet warning wrapped as procedure. A supervisor read instructions for dock inspections, then emphasized that bolts should be numbered and painted once installed. He said repeated substitutions by outside contractors had caused confusion, then urged rangers to photograph every ladder each week. He read slowly, reminding staff to check chain markings and to log any bright scrapes within 24 hours. He asked that vendor interactions stay cordial but detailed, and that cash counts should match posted hour sheets precisely. He repeated that night closures had reasons, and that the roped section protected a shelf known for unpredictable suction. The tape ended with a short statement that felt heavier than a standard sign-off, even to someone outside enforcement work. The supervisor said the lake keeps receipts, and he called tape steel a kind of ledger if you knew how to read. He then asked that all summaries be placed in the Saturday binder, followed by a written note in the permit folder. Rena returned the reels to their sleeves, then updated the entry in the inventory system with a quiet summary. She wrote that the contents included dispatch summaries, tower logs, and training instructions, and that these might interest risk management. She flagged the box for restricted copying and added a line suggesting improved storage due to evidentiary value. That night, she drove to the lake and parked by the official overlook, staying within the open hours like a normal visitor. The water looked glossy and harmless, and a steady breeze shoved new leaves across the shore in rattling waves. Families packed up coolers, while a ranger checked the rope line and reset a slack float with a practice tug. She walked the path between the tower and the snack stand, then down to the dock where the ladder bolts gleamed. They were painted red, and small numbers were stamped into the heads, which suggested a new practice after the tapes. A sign near the rope read "No entry, shelf unstable," and the letters were bold without clutter. A man in a lake crew shirt saw her taking photos and asked if she needed anything, and she said just admiring. He nodded and said they had redone the hardware, then added that the chain had been upgraded to a heavier gauge. He pointed out a new anchor a few yards deeper where the current used to pull and said it cost plenty. She asked if the improvements followed a particular incident, and he smiled without offering details, then looked toward the tower. He said the lake gets busier every year, and they prefer keeping rules friendly and simple to help everyone. He wished her a good evening and kept walking, tapping each cleat along the dock with a small hammer. At her desk the next morning, she wrote one final paragraph for the internal memo, careful with every single word. She explained that the tapes documented a pattern of weekend tampering around a hazardous shelf with persistent chain disturbances. She wrote that witnesses described idling trucks and partial plates, and that tower logs flagged a vendor for careful tracking. She recommended digitizing the reels, then filing them with risk management as potential warnings that improved current safety practices. She attached her timeline and map using initials and generic labels to avoid identifying anyone who might still live nearby. She kept her tone neutral because the point was preservation, not drama, and the tapes already carried weight. Before sealing the memo, she added a small line that explained how the tapes worked like a quiet lighthouse. They glowed in the dark of back rooms, keeping watch over a place that looked relaxed but demanded attention. They did not accuse anyone directly, but they pointed toward the triangle where the water kept its swift accounting. She delivered the memo to her supervisor, who skimmed it, then set it aside for the weekly folder without comment. He asked if the reels were labeled securely, and she said yes, and he nodded and said, "Good, thank you." The box returned to the shelf, but the entry now carried a bright strip indicating restricted handling under department guidance. A week later, risk management requested digital transfers, citing an internal review of seasonal safety procedures for public areas. They noted that the dock hardware had improved and that the chain layout matched new engineering reports after recent surveys. They asked for any additional recordings from surrounding years to complete their context for training material. Rena stayed out of that conversation because her role stopped at preservation, though she felt a calm sense of completion. The Saturday binder had finally spoken in full sentences, and everything pointed toward the same quiet conclusion. The tapes were a warning written in small sounds that added up to a clear map of careful harm. When she finally visited her sister that weekend, the stew tasted warm, and the apartment felt crowded with plants. She described none of the lake details, only saying she liked hearing old voices explain rules that still mattered today. Her sister laughed and said she had always loved rule followers because they were the ones who kept doors from sticking. In the months that followed, the dock signs stayed bright, the chains stayed tight, and the roped section kept its distance. Families watched sunsets without wandering across the floats, while rangers checked the ladder bolts and stamped numbers. A new plaque near the overlook said thank you to volunteers for years of safe seasons without naming anyone specifically. People told stories anyway, because lakes attract stories, and most were harmless and not entirely accurate. Rena preferred the tapes because they never chased drama, and they always returned to measured facts. They cared about footprints on silt and bright scrapes on metal and the way a current can tell time. If someone asked her privately why a box of tapes mattered, she offered a simple answer without personal detail. The lake taught the staff to listen for small patterns, and the tapes taught the staff to write them down. Warnings are not always loud, and sometimes they arrive as quiet instructions that keep strangers safe. She thought of the supervisor who said the lake keeps receipts, and she believed him without needing a name or headline. The water gave back bolts and shavings and slack rope, and the staff learned to read that ledger patiently. In that way, the old Saturday voices kept working, guiding hands without demanding attention or applause. By the next summer, the tower logged more visitors and fewer citations, and the vendor stand sold cold drinks, not bait. The chain still hummed on windy nights, but people heard it as a plain boundary, not a rumor. The tapes stayed in climate storage, digitized and labeled, a warning preserved as training rather than tragedy. When the county finally archived the memo with the transfer receipts, Rena slid a copy into her personal binder. She liked the neatness of an ending that did not demand a dramatic reveal, only patient steps that matched evidence. The lake did not need a ghost, it needed attention, and those tapes had asked for it many years ago. She drove by the overlook after work one evening, watching the sun burn down into a clean line on the water. A ranger tapped the cleats again, just like before, and the chain lay tight and bright across the current. The triangle she drew on paper felt like a familiar shape in her mind, precise and ordinary, and finally understood.